Hey guys, this is Chris from Almost Legit Garage, and today we are going to show you how to get rid of this huge wheel to fender gap. So we are going to be installing lowering springs on the GTI. I had previously bought the lowering springs back when we had the Miata and we were autocrossing the Miata, but that ended up not working out so well. It met a untimely death. So we went back to racing the GTI, and the lowering springs never got installed because this thing runs in, or had run in stock class, which doesn't allow for changing of springs. It does allow for the changing of shock absorbers, just not the changing of springs. So now that I've finally decided we're going to jump class, we're going to see how much faster we can make this car. I've pretty much driven it to the max of what it was capable of before. So we're going to see if we can actually make it any faster. This is a little bit more expensive than just racing stock class, but I think it'll be a lot more fun and keep me interested in the car. So let's get started. So first what I've done is I've put the car up on my big blocks. So I put one on each tire, and that allows me to get some clearance underneath the car, because the first thing you're going to want to do is measure the toe to the best of your ability, so you can get it set back close to what it was once the car is lowered, because that will change your suspension geometry a little bit. So I did that, and I also took off the trim piece for the wiper cowl, and I took the wipers off because you'll need to do that to get to the strut tops. There and there, and then we should be able to we should be good to go. So I'm going to kind of talk you guys through how to measure the toe, take notes of it, and then duplicate it once you're done. Okay guys, so this is a pretty simple process. All you got to do is pick one of the ribs in the tires, and I'm going with the inside one because that center ribs have like the little wavy pattern to them, and then you're just going to read the tape measure. So that is pretty much exactly 53.5 in the back there. So as long as you measure this before and measure after and it's relatively close, you should be pretty good. There's not a whole lot that should affect it, but also when you lift them up on this blocks, make sure you release the tension off the suspension by letting off the e-brake and letting off the brakes and let it roll just a hair. There's a little bit of you got a little bit of room on the blocks to do that, but that's what you're going to want to do first. Alright guys, so to start off, you're going to break loose the axle bolt. This is a big bolt, so it's going to take a lot of force. It should have a couple hundred foot-pounds of torque underneath it. Once that's off, you can start removing your wheel to gain access to it. You'll have to have the vehicle raised up at this point. You'll want to have both sides in the air so the sway bar doesn't have any tension on it. Yeah, then you can run that center bolt all the way out once you get the vehicle up in the air and the wheels off. And like I said, it's one-time use, so chuck that right in the trash. Alright. So next you're going to need to remove your fender liner to get the sway bar end links off. There's just not quite enough room to get in there without doing that. So as you can see, there's just a few bolts here and there. I believe they're a T25 or T27 torque spit. A little impact driver like mine helps make the process go a little bit quicker. If you have the splash shield underneath it or when you're doing this, then you're going to have to loosen that and probably remove it also. Make sure you put your nuts in a safe location. And once everything's removed, that just kind of pops out of there. And also a little PB blaster helps make everything go a little bit easier. I ended up trying first to take off the upper end link, and that one was seized, so I had to remove the lower. I ended up having to cut the upper off and replace the whole thing because I couldn't get it to tighten down quite enough after that. And again, having the sway bar loose is going to help. You're also going to need to remove the ride height sensor for the auto leveling headlights. Then you can remove the cross bolt for the strut, holding the strut. It is a really large, I think, 14 millimeter triple square that holds the bolt, but if you don't have that, you can sometimes get away with using vice grips like you just saw. Then you're going to break loose the 3 bolts for the lower ball joint to the control arm. This is a lot easier than trying to take off the where the ball joint goes into the knuckle. You're going to insert the knuckle spreader tool on the back side. It's kind of an elliptical looking thing. I'll try to post a picture of it later so you guys can see what it is, but it's an elliptical, and basically that just spreads the strut because the spreads the knuckle because the strut goes into it. Now obviously it's kind of hard to see because I'm kind of hunched over it. A couple whacks with the hammer can help get it moving because it's really difficult for it to, or really difficult to get it off. And then all of a sudden, bam! Once you get in the right spot, in the right position, it just kind of falls off. As you can see, this is why you also wanted to take the axle loose, otherwise it gets in the way. Also wanted to note, don't pull too hard on the brake lines or the ABS wires. Now this is where you break loose the top 3 bolts that hold the strut in. It's not uncommon for them to have problems where the nut comes loose, the captured nut in the strut top comes loose. Okay guys, sorry I had to skip you about a couple things, but so this is, I got the strut out, and unfortunately one of the little captured nuts decided to break off on this side. The other side had done that as well last time I had this apart. So that's unfortunate, but anyways, what I managed to do to get around that was I used the impact to kind of knock, or to loosen the nut real quick to get the strut out the bottom, and make sure you're standing really clear when you do it, because it'll just kind of, it'll go straight down, but there's some spring tension there and you really don't want to pinch your fingers or anything like that. But that's what I had to do. Then I could grab the bottom with vice grips, and then I could use the impact to finish taking that bolt out. And that, I mean, that sucks, but I got it. And conveniently enough, we managed to skip a step, so we're here. So in just a second, I'm going to show you guys, or I'm going to put the camera back on, and I'm going to put the new spring on. Alright, so now it's time to put the new coil spring in. I was showing you guys the writing goes upright. That way you can check the orientation of it. The bottom of the spring has a edge that kind of fits into a pocket on the spring perch. So you want to make sure the coil spring is aligned properly for that. And then it kind of sits a little crooked on the top mount until you get everything tight. So don't worry about that too much. I'm using spring compressors here, although you might be able to make it work without them. It just depends on what tools you have available. You can also rent spring compressors pretty easy from like AutoZone or Advanced, so it's not really that big of a deal to get a hold of them. I'm just using my little mini impact driver on this. I wouldn't use a full-size air impact because they can spin a little too quick and they're a little bit harder to control. But this little one doesn't put out a whole lot of torque, so it's not going to compress anything too quickly. Also wanted to note, make sure you get the hex side of the spring compressor up. It makes it a lot easier to take off once you get everything reinstalled. Now these also come the springs also came with updated bump stops. They're just a little bit shorter and I believe a little bit stiffer to compensate for the change in spring rate and ride height. You're also going to have to re-extend the shock if you have something like the Conies, because they don't really have that much of a nitrogen charge to them. If you have Bilsteins, then you're going to omit the bump stop because they're internal, and also they have a little bit more of a nitrogen charge to them, so you're not even going to really have to worry about extending it back out. Then you're just going to tighten the 22 millimeter socket on the top just by hand until you get the spring compressor or until you get the spring compressors off. Like I said, you can just kind of buzz them off with the little mini impact thing. Once you get the strut into the vehicle, you can actually torque it. There are special wrenches that are kind of hard to come by for tightening the struts, because you're really not supposed to tighten them down too hard with an impact or anything like that. But you can also use, in this case, because it's a 22 millimeter, a O2 sensor socket, because it has the hex part at the top. You can grab the side of that and tighten that, and you can also put a 1/4 inch extension with a small socket underneath it through the hole in the top of the O2 sensor socket, and use that to hold the strut from spinning. I know it's a little bit confusing, but if you go to do it and you happen to have an O2 sensor socket laying around, it'll make sense. And an O2 sensor socket's a lot like a spark plug socket, so you might look there if you have a smaller nut, because there are some discrepancies between shock types and whatnot. So now I'm getting the knuckle put back on the strut. Really, you're just going to kind of swing it up, line it up, and then using a jack to put a little pressure on it. I was lucky enough that the knuckle spreader managed to stay in place, so I just kind of popped the ratchet off that, left it in place, made getting this started a lot easier. So basically, you're gonna kind of wiggle it a little bit in a bunch of directions, try to get it up high enough. Once it's kind of stuck in there nice and good, you can realign your lower ball joint, or realign your axle, then realign your lower ball joint, get everything together, and then work from there. It's kind of a different juggling act to get it all working, but if you take your time and speed everything up 4x, it doesn't really take that long. As you can see, and that's a joke. It's just a terrible joke. So yeah, it's all a struggle. You can use the end of a long breaker bar or a crowbar to kind of pull the control arm down to make life a little bit easier. The way these lower control arms are, they have like a hex configuration going into the rear mount, so it's going to want to kind of neutral out no matter what. But once you get that all lined up, you can put some pressure on the jack and mess around with your knuckle spreader until it drops in. These have been off a couple times, or these have been off before, so there's kind of some spots in the inside of the knuckle that are dented because the spring or the knuckle spreader kind of digs in sometimes. Apart from that, just time. Sometimes you can use this like a coin, like a penny or something like that, to act as a spacer to get you a little bit more travel out of it. But it's just about finding the right spot that works. Once you get the knuckle all the way seated, you can put the bolt in and tighten it down. Impact makes it nice, but you can grab the end of the cross bolt with vice grips if you don't have the big, I think it's a 14 triple square, which are kind of hard to come by. I believe all I'm doing here is lining up the the sway bar end link, and then you're going to tighten that back down. I've found on my car it's a lot easier to do the lower one than it is to do the top one. Now we're on to the rear. Pretty simple. Jack the car up, take the wheel off. And luckily, because it has the parking brake on it, it doesn't, or you should be able to get it with a regular breaker bar if you forgot to loosen the lug nut before you lifted the car up. Kind of just a side note. Then there's just literally one cross bolt. Break it loose by hand, and then you can blast it off with an impact. Then you're just going to put a jack to raise up the lower control arm. There's kind of a round spot where the spring goes, like the spring seats into, and you just put the jack right up there. Once you jack it up, you can pull that cross pin and pull the old spring right out. Now you're going to make sure that spring isolator goes on the new spring. Otherwise, you know, you'll have metal on metal, and that's not good. So then that just goes right back in the factory location. Just make sure that you have it in the lower spring isolator, and the top there's kind of a dome thing that everything rests in. So as long as those two things are there, it's not really that hard. You're just going to use the jack to lift the control arm right back up. You're going to kind of have to do some hand manipulation, make sure you don't pinch yourself, to get everything lined back up with the, I guess it'd be a rear knuckle, but really not that big of a deal. You're only going to the only problem you're going to run into is some twist with the lower control arm, just because the spring perch thing isn't exactly level with the ground. But you should be able to get the bolt pushed in, and then just a couple hammer taps, as long as you're not too far out, to get you all the way seated. And then retighten everything and you're done. Alright, so this first clip is of a Autocross run I did before I had the new springs installed. So you'll be able to kind of see the difference. And really it just comes to, or see and hear the difference. It really comes down to is just like body roll, and you can hear the tires are kind of rolling off a little bit more, so they're making, you know, a fair amount of noise compared to the run-on springs. You can see him fighting with the wheel a little bit more. The car's just not quite as predictable and not quite as planted. Also, you can't really see it from that section, but the car doesn't really catch itself as much as it does with the new springs. So here's a run on the springs. And now I haven't done an alignment or anything on this yet, so it's kind of a little bit iffy that way, but see the body stays flatter. I'm leaning into it hard, but the body stays pretty flat. Despite that hard corner, it's just a little squeal and not quite as much of a skid as previously. See there, the car got unweighted and the back end started to come around, but as soon as I got onto the brakes, it leveled right out. Alright, sorry about the mess, but it is what it is. Obviously, I'm sure if you guys are watching this, you have some questions and concerns about, you know, what it's like to drive the car now that it's lowered. Well, ultimately, it's really not that bad. It did take a little bit of tuning with the shocks to get it to a comfortable level, and even now it's probably not the best. I could probably turn down my shock rates a little bit to accommodate, but ultimately these are very stiff springs. These are about a 40% increase over the factory springs, and that's a lot when it comes to a lowering spring. So you're not really going to want to run these on factory shocks. They won't last long at all, and your ride quality is going to be pretty shitty. I had this set a couple days ago at about the I don't know, 60% stiff mark. At least, you know, 60% of the adjustment turned in or whatever, because these are conies, and they were still too soft for the springs. I was actually getting kind of some wheel hop and some shimmy out of them because of it. So this takes these take one hell of a shock to keep control of everything. So that's something to keep in mind. Although the springs are fairly inexpensive, I think when I bought them they were on sale for like $135. You're gonna have to buy some fairly expensive shocks to keep everything in order. On to ride quality, yeah, they ride pretty good. You can definitely tell that you have a stiffer spring rate, but it's not overly jarring, and you know, it doesn't really seem to bottom out on much. You know, anytime you increase the spring rate, you're going to increase the NVH, but honestly, it's not anything to steer you away from it. The shocks themselves made this car stiffer than the springs in addition to it did, so not really that bad. The handling is definitely an improvement, even on the street. You don't notice it so much, but you definitely get a lot more feedback and feel, probably from the additional camber that you get. It just kind of keeps everything tracking straight and keeps the car from following lines as much. So good in that respect. The low is about that appropriate level. I have a fairly steep driveway, and if I back straight out, I just barely scrape my bumper on it. Anybody who has any kind of you know, reasonable driveway or anything like that, it shouldn't be a problem at all. They're rated at a 1.2 drop, but because mine's one of the earlier years, I think 06 and 07, it was actually more of like a 1.8 drop. But either way, it's not that bad. It's definitely, you know, 100% usable. And apart from that, I mean, we'll see how the quality is in the long run. Well, I won't, because I'm taking these off shortly. I just pretty much had these laying around, so I figured I'd throw them on before I do my coilovers, just to see what the difference is. I like a kind of basis of comparison. But pretty soon I'll be putting my nice coilovers on. I'll do an unboxing video, so keep an eye out for that. But yeah, don't be afraid of these at all. Just keep in mind, if you're planning on running factory shocks, you're going to want to get a different set of lowering springs. I think H&Rs make a pretty decent one, and it's only a 15% increase in spring rate, which would be appropriate for a decent set of shocks. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys learned something, and stick around, subscribe if you want to see more on this car. There's a lot of build coming up on this, so we're going to be trying to make this thing track fast in a bigger and more substantial way. So stick around, like I said, subscribe, and leave a comment if there's anything worth noting. But thank you guys for watching. Later.